Okay. So what we're going to talk about before lunch is to give you just some general principles for best practices for conducting a literature search for a systematic review. And so I'm sure all of you in this room have done a literature search before. And so you're thinking, why on earth do I need you to tell me how to do a literature search? And the reason why is because doing a systematic literature search is a little bit more difficult, takes a little bit more thought, and obviously you want to be transparent, you want to document everything in the interest of replicability. And really, this is the key method for you identifying and sampling, essentially participants, if you will, or cases in your systematic review. So really, this is one of the most important pieces of your systematic review. So it's important to take your time and ensure that you have a good search strategy, because if you have a crappy search strategy, then the results of your systematic review are going to be just as poor. So really, you want to make sure that you spend time vetting your search strategy and ensuring that you've got a comprehensive search strategy. So really, I mentioned this earlier, the key goal in a systematic literature search is often to identify the entire population of studies that meets your eligibility criteria. So that's why we started by saying, here's our research question, here are the types of studies we're going to include or exclude, and now we're going to go to the literature and try to identify every single study that's ever been done and reported, whether it's published or not, but reported in some format. And we want to include those and screen those to see if they're eligible for inclusion in our review. So the key tenets of a good systematic literature search are documentation. Please document your searches. Fortunately, there are lots of resources that will help you with this documentation. But what I mean by that is documenting the search string that you use, documenting the databases you search, documenting the dates that you search those databases, documenting the number of hits you got from each search, documenting each step along the way. Transparency is also key, and that's why we document these things, so that we can be transparent when we report the findings from our literature search. Diversity is really a key thing when you're doing systematic literature searches, and by that I mean searching for diverse sources of information. So you can't just do a PubMed search and call it quits. That is not a systematic literature search, okay? That's going to identify probably, 75 to 90% of your literature, depending on your topic area. But you need to look for what we're going to call the gray literature, the hard-to-locate literature. You need to do some supplementary searches, maybe some other databases that are going to capture social science literature, maybe sociology literature, social work literature. And so you need a diverse search strategy. And so we'll talk about different sources for that. And then finally, iteration. You're not going to go to PubMed and do a search in 15 minutes and be done. That does not exist. That works when you're doing a naive search strategy. I do it all the time. But for a systematic literature search, you are going to spend a week refining your search terms, talking with a librarian or an information retrieval specialist, reviewing those search terms, going back and changing your search terms to try to balance sensitivity and specificity of your searches. So it takes time. And it's not just a one-stop thing. And so I think just putting that out front, putting it up front so that people don't have unrealistic expectations, that this really can be a time-consuming process. Okay, so why do we do these comprehensive, diverse literature searches for our systematic reviews? The reason that we spend so much time doing this is because we know there's quite a bit of empirical evidence that establishes the dangers and the biases that come in naive search strategies. So we know that there's extensive literature that shows that, for instance, studies published in English, those indexed in certain databases, those that are freely available, those that are in your own discipline may be more likely to have statistically significant effects than those that maybe are less easy for you to access. And so we'll talk about this tomorrow in terms of publication bias, but this is a big issue in systematic reviewing and meta-analysis. If we're going to make the claim that we are synthesizing the current best available evidence, we need to have the totality of that body of evidence, and we don't want to be making claims based on a biased set of studies. Okay? And so publication bias is a big issue in systematic reviewing. It's also an issue in narrative literature reviews, but nobody ever talks about it. So We're trying to overcome those biases and those naive search strategies. And so the general steps, I've listed 7 steps here in your systematic literature search. So first is structuring your question, which we've now done, right? Second is choosing databases and sources. And I'll talk about kind of the main databases that you might use. Then you'll have to create a search strategy for each of those databases because each database has a different syntax structure. And then the step 4, review results and revise search, that's what takes the longest. That's you perfecting your search terms and making sure that you've got the appropriate sensitivity and specificity. Then you'll process your references, and I'll talk about some reference management software that I've used in the past. There are lots of options available today. And then really logging and reporting the search, that's documentation, okay? And we'll look at the Prisma flowchart that you'll be needing to document information so that you can report on that. And then the final thing to note is that most Cochrane and Campbell reviews, if they're longer reviews, you often will do a final updated search at the very end of the review to capture any studies that have been since published since you've been undertaking the review. And so that's an important last step. Okay. So structuring your research question, we've just spent most of the morning doing that, going through your research questions, thinking about using PCOS to develop your population intervention comparison outcome and study design terms. And so the reason that I wanted you to use that general structure is, again, those PCOS terms are going to be the core concepts that we're going to use for searching keywords in our databases. So, for instance, if we asked, are HIV behavioral intervention programs effective in promoting contraceptive use among youth aged 12 to 18, I've highlighted in bold here some of the concepts that may be useful search keywords when we go to PubMed or ProQuest and do our search. So I might want to search for HIV, contraceptive use, youth aged 12 to 18. And I've given you a couple of other examples there, but essentially those PCOS terms that we were talking about are going to be the terms that we can use to start developing our search strategies. In terms of choosing sources, okay, so most of you probably have your databases that you're familiar with and you use, and those will depend on your content area. And so those electronic databases like PubMed and ProQuest, those are going to be the main sources of your literature search. And again, most, 75% to 90% of your citations will probably come from one of those electronic databases. But, as I said, diversity is the key, so we're going to talk about some other methods in just a minute for identifying studies. Okay, so electronic databases, probably the most relevant ones for those of you in the room. iterate, which is indexed in ProQuest at my university. It might be indexed in EBSCO at your university, but you can also search iterate directly. PsycInfo and sociological abstracts are big ones, and at my university those are in ProQuest, but probably EBSCO for some of you. PubMed and Medline and Sonal are the big health and medicine databases, and I think based on our pre-survey, most of you are familiar with PubMed, and given that it's free, that's what we'll be using for our exercise today. But those are kind of the main ones, but there are lots of other electronic databases that are more subject-specific, and I've just listed them here based on crime and justice education, psychology, medicine, sociology, multidisciplinary. So really, I don't have a strong opinion about these necessarily. I'm just listing them here as other potential databases you might want to explore, but it depends on your content area. Other electronic databases, so obviously you'll want to search the Campbell and Cochrane library for reviews that have been done, because those reviews are going to be good sources of references for you. And I also use Google Scholar essentially for footnote chasing and gray literature searching, which I will talk about in just a minute. Now, some people ask about generic search engines, so not Google Scholar, but just Google, or I don't even know what other search engines, Bing, other search engines that people might use. And so those search engines, while very useful for kind of everyday, trying to find stuff, they're really not made for conducting systematic reviews, because you get a huge number of hits and most of those are going to be false positives. So you're going to have to wade through a lot of information, and they're really low yield. And so it's usually not recommended that you use those. And the reason why is because they're very inefficient, and it's very unsystematic if you say, oh, I'm going to search Google and then only go through the first 1,000 hits. Well, then you're relying on Google's prioritization schemes, which we don't have any information about how they're doing that prioritization. That's unsystematic, so we don't want to do that. So I don't recommend doing those. They're usually not high yield. They're not worthwhile. The only time that I might use them is at the very end of a systematic review. I call it sort of like a sanity check. When I know all of my included studies, I'm now very familiar with the literature, I might just do a quick Google search to make sure something doesn't pop up that I've never seen before. But really, that's the only time I use those generic search engines. Okay, so footnote chasing, otherwise or sometimes called reference harvesting, is a very useful way for you also to find potentially eligible references. And people have different strategies for footnote chasing. Typically, when I do footnote chasing, I will always review the reference lists of any studies that are eligible and included in my review. And I will always use review the reference lists of any prior literature reviews, systematic or not, and prior meta-analyses on the same topic. And those are actually a very nice place to start because if you go through those meta-analyses and systematic reviews on the same or similar topic, that can be a good way for you to also do kind of scoping to see what language people are using to get a feel for the key studies in an area. If you have time and resources, it's also an excellent idea to review the reference lists of ineligible studies if you can, but often that can be cost prohibitive and time prohibitive. Okay, so forward citation searching is another way for you to identify studies. And so essentially what I mean by that is if you have your eligible studies that are included, you can then look to see what subsequent studies have cited those studies. And the two sources that you can use are Google Scholar and Web of Science. I personally prefer Google Scholar because it tends to have more great literature coverage than Web of Science, but either one is fine. And I typically only do this with my eligible studies. And what this looks like, so let's say we had this, well, you could even use a meta-analysis, and you wanted to see, okay, well, what other studies have actually cited this study? This is Web of Science. Over here, it's got 11 times cited, and if you click on that, it will then give you the 11 articles that have cited that. So then you can scan through those titles and abstracts and see if any of those are relevant for you to download and include in the systematic review. In Google Scholar, it looks like this. It's the cited by. And that's why I tend to use it, because Google Scholar often has a higher number of citations than Web of Science, so I find it a higher yield. So this is a nice supplementary search strategy to try to identify any sources that you did not pick up in your electronic search. Now, another supplementary search strategy is to have contact with experts. And so this can vary in terms of how it looks. This can just be a simple email to some of your colleagues saying, hey, I'm doing a systematic review on this topic area. Could you send me citations to any work that you're doing? Or you might have, here's my list of currently included studies. Do you have any to add? Sometimes people will email listservs for organizations that you might be on, or if you know some pretty big names in the field who are doing some of the primary studies, it's good to email them. But this can vary quite a bit depending on what your content matter is and who might be relevant to contact. And then a final sort of supplementary search strategy is what is called hand searching. And so that's because, in the 1990s, it was actually hand searching where you went to the library, pulled off, the journals from the library shelf, and then went through, the journals and actually screened to see if there were any studies that might be eligible. The beauty, of the internet is that now you can actually do the hand searching online because most journals have their tables of contents available. with abstracts and titles, so you can actually do that online, although some you might actually still have to go to the library. Now, when I do hand searching, I think of these as supplementary searches to ensure that you have not missed citations in your electronic search, right? Because when we build our electronic search strategy, our goal is going to be as comprehensive and sensitive as possible in the hopes that we're not omitting anything. But we're human. We may miss something in that search. Some journals have really poor indexing in databases, and so maybe you need to do a hand search of those. And so really what I try to do when I do hand searching is any flagship journals where you think that's where the people are going to be publishing, if they are, and so you want to make sure you didn't miss them in your electronic search, or journals that are poorly indexed, and then ideally, hopefully journals will have electronic tables of contents that you can use. Now, for some of you who are interested in topic areas where there may be ongoing clinical trials, you can also search clinicaltrials.gov and the WHO's International Clinical Trials Registry. These will actually help you identify ongoing trials that maybe the results have not been published yet. Maybe there are some technical reports that are available or will be available soon, and so those can be useful, but again, that may not be relevant for many of you in this room if people aren't actually registering their protocols for their trials on these websites. Okay, so I've been using the term gray literature quite a bit, and so what do I mean by that? There are lots of different definitions of gray literature, but here I'm using that to define any literature that is not controlled by a commercial publisher. But in general, when people use the term gray literature, they mean hard to find, difficult to locate literature that's not, available in PubMed. And so again, in the interest of minimizing the potential for publication bias, we want to include gray literature in our systematic reviews and meta-analyses. We know that studies that are published in peer-reviewed journal articles tend to be more likely to have statistically significant positive effects. And so that's why we always encourage authors to include gray literature. And so this might include conference proceedings, research reports or technical reports that are available on websites, books or book chapters, dissertations or theses, reports available on organization websites. And so really, there are lots of sources for good gray literature. Now, I'm waiting for somebody to raise their hand. Raise their hand and tell me that unpublished research is not as good. David was like, no, that was not me. So usually this is where people always say, well, why do you want to include gray literature, right? Because if it's a technical report, it's not going to be as high quality. Or why are you going to include a dissertation? That's not going to be as high quality as a published journal article. And actually, it's nice that I have AIR folks in the room, because I usually say, well, places like AIR and MDRC and APT publish technical reports on their websites all of the time, which I would say are much better quality than most of the peer-reviewed journal articles that I read. Pause for applause. Yes, David.
I just want to know how low do you go? Do you go, say, blogs of experts who are...
It's an eligibility criteria question, right? So how often have you seen a blog that reported results from an empirical study that actually would meet your eligibility criteria? Probably not. So I know that that's an extreme example, but the one that people often will balk at are conference proceedings, because those, typically will present the findings of an empirical study, but they may be preliminary. And so, that is one where you occasionally will see people say it has to be reported in a full report version to where you can make those assessments. Because most conference proceedings may not have the information you need to be able to assess attrition or to assess baseline equivalence. Those quality thresholds that we talked about, if you have those in your eligibility criteria, then most of those will fall out anyway. And so that's what I would say, is that you make it about your eligibility criteria rather than publication status. And most people who have problems with dissertations, technically dissertations are peer-reviewed. So there is that. I mean, I've read lots of bad dissertations, but I've also read lots of bad journal articles. So it's not publication status that we need to be worried about. It's quality of the research. So a final place for you to look at gray literature, something that I will do if I have the time and the resources, is also to look at the CVs of the first authors of the studies that are included in your review. And this can actually be useful for identifying ongoing studies if you go and find those authors. But for that you have to have the time and some research assistants who can actually do that for you, because that takes a lot of time to skim through the internet and look at people's CVs. So I've listed here some databases that can be useful for identifying gray literature or unpublished literature. And again, there is no situation in which you would search all of these. The reason I'm putting them all up here is just because you might want to just check some of them out and see if they are relevant to your research. So one thing to note is Eric, which you're probably going to be searching anyway, actually has gray literature in it, so that's fantastic. Some other ones to point out, some common. So dissertation abstracts, international, that's at my university I access that through ProQuest, and so that's a good source of gray literature. Dis Online is, I think that's German dissertations, and so that's useful. And then let's see, Theses Canada, and I think Index to Theses is the UK version. So there are some good sources for getting those international dissertations. So just check out some of these, but essentially they're places that you're going to be going to try to find studies you might have missed in your electronic search. And then I didn't mention this too much, but obviously organization websites, so if there are research firms who are doing research in your area, go to their website and look at their technical reports. AIR, NDRC, Mathematica, these are places you might want to look. If there are conferences where people are going to be presenting this type of research, go look through the conference proceedings of the last several years. Those are clear, high-yield places for you to look. Okay. I'm going to pause there and see if you have questions about search sources. So specific databases, where you should be searching. I don't want to overwhelm you by providing you with so many database lists. So just to give you a feel, when I do a systematic review on, say, an alcohol intervention for youth, my search typically would involve PubMed and ProQuest. And within ProQuest, I would search PsycInfo, sociological abstracts, kind of the big ones. Then I would probably do some supplementary searches of maybe 2 or 3 journals. So alcoholism, Journal of Substance Abuse Treatment, addiction. Then I might do searches of 2 conferences that are the big ones. And then I would probably have content experts, so maybe a listserv email, and then maybe 3 or 4 kind of other supplementary databases. So there are some good alcohol databases for gray literature that I might search, and then that's usually it. Okay, so really these supplementary searches, again, are meant to supplement those electronic searches and make sure you haven't missed anything. In my systematic reviews, 75 to 80% of my search hits come from that main database search. Questions about? No? Okay, so let's see what we can get through before lunchtime with creating search strategies. So the first thing to do, and so this is creating search strategies for your main database. So let's think PubMed or ProQuest. First thing is consult with an information retrieval specialist or your librarian. And if you don't have one of those, if you're working with Campbell, reach out to us and we can put you in contact with somebody. If you're working with Cochrane, they can do the same. But obviously, it's good to have somebody to help you vet these search strategies. And some initial things for you to think about. So first, what are your key terms? Those are the PICOS terms that we talked about earlier. And then usually what I do is I start by doing a naive search in my database of choice and use this to what's sometimes called pearl growing, where you do a naive search and look through the hits that you get and use that to start growing some pearls of search terms that might be useful or synonyms for concepts that might be useful. So if I search for delinquency, but I see people are actually calling it disruptive problem behavior, I can add disruptive problem behavior to my list of potential keywords I need to be searching for. Something else to be thinking about is if you are working in an environment where the topic is multidisciplinary in nature, people in different disciplines often will use different concepts and different terms for the same construct. So delinquency, externalizing problem behavior. Sociologists and psychologists, right? We're not using the same terms. But I know that psychologists are calling this externalizing problem behavior, so I know I need to be searching for that. And so if you're not aware of that, sometimes it's good to talk to your other colleagues, talk to your review team to see what disciplines might actually be using this or be researching this concept. So then you're going to say, here are my PICOS terms. Then you need to start thinking about synonyms. And then what we'll talk about this afternoon is looking to see how those keywords or synonyms for these concepts are represented in the controlled vocabulary of the database you're using. So when I talk about keywords, delinquency, externalizing problem behavior, disruptive problem behavior, those are keywords that I can just search in a database. Now, most databases, though, have controlled vocabularies which have essentially been used to index and categorize terms into different buckets or hierarchies. And so probably for those of you who use PubMed, you're familiar with the medical subject heading mesh terms, and so that's the controlled vocabulary in PubMed. Mtree is what's used in Embase. Eric has a controlled vocabulary of thesaurus. But essentially, and I'll show you what this looks like after lunch, is externalizing problem behavior may be then categorized under a bigger bucket of conduct disorder. And so if I'm searching in PubMed, I not only can search by the keyword delinquency, but I can also search under the mesh heading of conduct disorder. And so it gets a little tricky to teach this, in an hour or two, because again, we could probably spend a week just on literature searching in PubMed. But the thing for you to know is that you can do keyword searches, you can do control vocabulary searches, and you can combine those. And we'll see what that looks like with PubMed this afternoon. Okay, so a couple things that I would like to point out now is that truncation characters when you're building search terms can be useful, and so by that I mean these little asterisks, and essentially what those can be used is to expand a term. So if I use CRIM asterisk, that will search in the database crime, criminal, criminology, anything that has crim as a prefix with letters after it. And so that can be useful if you've got terms where you need to expand those terms. We'll also talk about Boolean operators in just a second. We talked about time limits, and I'll talk about search filters or limits. I'll save that until we actually get into PubMed. Okay, so the three important operators that you will use when you're searching are and, or, and not. And they seem very simple, but it's good just to make sure we're all on the same page about what we mean. So, and, if I search for cat and dog, essentially I'm only going to retrieve any studies that use the terms cat and dog simultaneously. So I'm only getting these studies with the overlap in the middle. If I search for cat or dog, I'm going to get any study that uses the word cat plus any study that uses the word dog. Okay, so that's expanding the search. If I say cat, not dog, I will get this half of the cats, and I will miss those in the intersection. Okay, and so ands and ors are the primary operators that we're going to be used. Ands help restrict your search hits, and ors will expand them. And when we build our search strategies this afternoon, we're actually going to use combinations of ands and ors. Nots, I would say use sparingly. You need to be very, very careful using a not, and I actually never use them. I think the only time I ever use a not is if I want to say not an animal study, if I'm only doing like human participant research. But otherwise, they can be very dangerous because you might be notting out something that you actually are very interested in. So you just need to be careful with nots. Since we're not talking about Ovid, ProQuest, or EBSCO, I provided you this little table, but we're not going to be using these databases. But just to give you a feel for the types of search functionality that might be available in other databases, you've got those truncation characters you've already seen. Sometimes you can use wildcards as well, and that can be useful if you've got sort of British versus English spelling, like randomized with a Z versus an S. And then some databases also have these proximity searches. So I want to find the word alcohol near women, and that has to be within one word of it. So those can be useful as well. But we'll go through PubMed, which I think is probably one of the easier databases to search in and the most flexible. So you can't see this graph too well. These are actually 4 columns. A P column, an I column, a C column, and an O column, which should look familiar, PICO, right? And the way that I typically encourage people when they're starting to draft out their search strategies is within each of these columns, start listing out synonyms for your P terms. So if you're interested in what are the effects of alcohol interventions for adolescents with substance use disorders, population synonyms might be adolescent, teen, teenager, student, middle school, high school, youth. Any others? Kids. Right? So those are all synonyms that we might list in this column. Then for intervention, I might have alcohol, drinking, drinks, so on and so forth. The comparison column, I always put this up here, but usually when you're searching, you don't search for comparison conditions unless you're doing like a treatment A versus treatment B comparison. You might, but if you're doing kind of business as usual comparisons, you obviously don't have search terms for those. And then sometimes your outcomes, again, you may not search for those. You may want to have a broader search, but it can be useful to use outcome search terms as well. And then what that's going to look like in our database is we're going to search for adolescents or kids or students or youth and alcohol or drinking or substance use and comparison or control and, if we wanted an outcome. So you essentially combine down the column with an or and combine across these blocks with ands, right? And so essentially you build your search that way. And we'll see what this looks like when we work in PubMed today. So if I was going to look at life skills training programs and trying to see if they're effective in promoting independence among individuals with disabilities, we might just use a very generic population term of DISAB with an asterisk. And then the intervention might just be living skills, life skills. You could probably think of some other synonyms there. Independence, financial skills, money skills, stuff like that. You might want to have some comparison conditions. Sometimes if you're only restricting to RCTs, you might include terms like experiment or trial or RCT. I tend to not use much in these blocks, but again, I like to put them up there in case they're relevant for yours. So, how was the searching exercise? Searching is complicated, right? It usually takes more than a few tries, and so there's some iteration that has to happen. But I saw a lot of you do essentially what we were talking about, starting with a naive search to start to build those terms and those synonyms, and then building up to a more complex search strategy. So any thoughts or reactions that you'd like to share with the group, things that you found during your own search experience? Yes.
Well, so I found that the word coma, which I thought had a pretty specific definition in traumatic brain injury, actually also turns up in ophthalmology studies as well, which has nothing to do with what I'm interested in, but I can't rule it out. So I was talking to you about what do I do, because I don't want to do an and statement, and it's basically you just have to weed out those ophthalmology studies.
Yeah, and so that's a very common occurrence when you start to deal with these search strategies, is you may find a term that really is essential for your review and you can't omit it, but really it's a term used in other literatures. And so what that means is you're going to get more hits that are irrelevant, but that's just part of it, and that's to be expected. And so, if we take a sensitive search strategy approach where we're trying to ensure that we get every possible hit that is relevant, you are going to have those false positives that you're going to have to weed out at the abstract screening phase, and that's to be expected. Now, if you end up getting 20,000 extra hits, that's when it becomes a problem, and you need to think carefully and consult with your librarian about other search strategies that you can use to weed down the number of hits. But if it's, increasing it by 50 or 100 hits, that's something that you usually just will screen out at the abstract phase.
And would you report that in your methods, that's what contributed to dropping from, or you just say you screen the photograph?
Typically, what's going to be reported and what's expected for you to report is to actually just report your search string. And so that's often reported in an appendix just so that peer reviewers and other people could come behind you and replicate your work. And so there's not usually a lot of narrative about the rationale for that. Now, if you're publishing a Campbell review, that search string typically will be vetted during the protocol phase, and so we typically have library scientists or information retrieval folks review the search strings to make sure there's not some glaring omission or some serious problem with that search string. Other thoughts or reactions to the exercise? And I know for some of you, PubMed is not really going to be the primary database. So David ended up searching ProQuest because he had his institutional access on his computer. So for those of you who are doing social science topics that really aren't focused on health and medicine, ProQuest and PsycInfo within ProQuest are typically going to be your main databases. Now, the search strategies that we discussed here apply to any database. What's going to differ slightly across databases are the types of operators you use, the syntax you use, and then the exporting functionality, of course. Other questions about searching? Okay.